Work meant to pull and lift all the rod would stand, then lower it quickly and wind the reel. It is fun for only a little while. My ambition, of course, was to land 100-pound tuna on light tackle, something which had not yet been done. So I was in deadly earnest. So was Captain Dan. This fish was so loggy and roily that we decided he was a yellowfin tuna of very large size. There are two kinds of tuna, yellowfin and bluefin. My brother and our guests made considerable fun of me as I heroically struggled with that tuna. I would lift him and wind him up 100 feet or so, and then he would take the line away from me. It happened so often that it must have looked funny. All of a sudden, my tuna started to sound. He did not run. He just plugged down and down and down. The reel screamed, "Zee, zee, zee." This procedure grew alarming. 200 yards, 300 yards, 350, and finally 400 yards of line he took straight down. This was the deepest I had ever had any fish sound up to that date. Captain Dan stood beside me watching the reel. He shook his head at every Z. My rod lay in the hollow of my left elbow, and the tip was doubled straight down. The Z, Z, Z grew markedly shorter in time and farther apart. Tremendous pressure of water on that tuna had begun to tell. Most remarkable about this incident was the fact that the 9-thread line had not broken. It resembled a very tight, wet banjo string. Finally, the tuna stopped. I had half an inch of thickness of line left on the reel spool. Then I began to work, carefully lifting and winding inch by inch, and after a while, foot by foot. This was harder work than heavy tackle. It took an hour to pump that tuna back up to his original position. I was as wet as if I had fallen overboard. For 2 more hours I heaved and wound, gaining and losing in about the same proportion. What spurred me on was a certainty that little by little the tuna was weakening. But it was so little. The others on board stopped making game of me. They began to realize that this was a fight seldom recorded in the annals of angling. Besides, I must have been an object to excite wonder and pity, perhaps awe. My tuna hung around near the boat, sometimes rising toward the surface, to one side or the other, but mostly straight down. That is what makes a tuna fight so laborsome. The very thing I feared, he began again. He started down. Z, 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 slower this time. Captain Dan left the wheel and stood beside me watching the reel. I laid the rod over my left arm and watched too. Z, Z, Z. It was terrible to see all that hard-earned line slip off and off and off. I would lose him this time. That was inevitable. Z, Z, Z. He plugged down. I could feel him banging the leader with his tail. Slower and slower the line paid off. It seemed ages in going. I began to see red. I wanted him to hurry and break off. But more than that, I hoped desperately that he would stop. How short and slow and squeaky the Z's. At last he got out as much line as he had taken on the first occasion. There were 450 yards on the reel. Captain Dan threw up his big hands and groaned, "Good night, it's all off." I suppose he meant the fight was all off. Assuredly, the tuna was still on. Z, Z, Z. I bade him a mute and despondent farewell. But the line still held. It seemed to me that the thing which had to snap was in my head. I was nearly crazy. The making of angling history is sometimes painful. Z, Z, Z. Slower and slower. Then, incredibly, when a couple of Z's more would have pulled all the line out and broken it, the tuna stopped. The strain eased. He could not stand the pressure of water. He had started back. I wound and wound and wound that reel until I thought my arm would fall dead at my side. With a small reel, it takes a great deal of winding to get in even a little line. This time it took perhaps half an hour to get all the line back.